Good evening, everyone. I'm monitoring the video here. It's a little hot, I think. Wendy, can you see on the audio there? It's okay. Welcome, everyone. We're in Taizando, I think, for the first time as a floor Dharma talk. So, as some of you have noticed, we're wearing masks. We've had a couple of COVID cases in the community, which we're just coming to the other side of. So hopefully tomorrow morning, we'll all test and be without masks. You can be welcome to join us as usual. I guess do I introduce myself? Does anybody not know who I am? Great, me too. All right. So,
do you want this in your ear the whole time?
I guess not. I'm just afraid it's gonna. All right, I better leave the meeting. So my name's Kodo. I'm a priest here at Upaya and the director, and my Dharma brother Kozan is El Presidente, and we've been. Well, I guess I won't speak for you, but I've had a lot of joy in throwing snowballs and receiving snowballs for over 10 years. And it's always a joy to give a Dharma talk together because I never really know what's going to happen. And we have, maybe we should just start with discussion now. No. So we should start with the chant before the Dharma talk, though. Yeah. All right. Dharma is vast and subtle. We now have a chance to hear it, study it, and practice it. We vow to realize its true meaning. The Dharma is vast and subtle. We now have a chance to hear it, study it, and practice it. We vow to realize its true meaning. The Dharma is vast and subtle. We now have a chance to hear it, study it, and practice it. We vow to realize its true meaning. Thank you, everyone. Well, welcome to our serene mountain hall. Today's Juneteenth, so happy Juneteenth. June 19th is our newest federal holiday. And for anyone who doesn't know exactly what that means, I had to look it up myself to kind of get the details, and there's a lot of details that I won't go into tonight. But just briefly, June 19th, 1865 was the day that Major General Gordon Granger ordered the final enforcement of the Emancipation Proclamation in Texas at the end of the American Civil War. So it's the day that commemorates the end of slavery in the U.S., and so it's been celebrated for a few decades now, but really became an official holiday, I think, in 2020. What's interesting, just a little bit of details, is the Emancipation Proclamation itself was, it first began in 1862, but the final proclamation by Abraham Lincoln was on January 1st, 1863. So it took just about 2.5 years for the Civil War to wrap up. I mean, you could say the effects lasted a long time after, but at that phase. And so, and that's just the kind of the feeling of it in a way. It's, yes, the emancipation happened that day, and we're still living into what that means for us and trying to actualize that freedom. what it entailed then. I read an article, interesting article in the Times, of what freedom meant for the formerly enslaved people in Texas and across the states that had like at the time lawful slaves. It really wasn't, what we would call freedom today, of course. So they were technically free, but still had all of these restrictions, all of these, horrible, dehumanizing rules and laws. And as with other things, we're still feeling that and living into how we can remediate that or not fix it, but address it as best we can. So on this day, however, we celebrate freedom, emancipation, not just for those peoples who were enslaved, but in general, I think, freedom of all beings, freedom of all expression in this world. And so it is a celebration, and it's an opportunity for us to learn and remember, how did we get here? What were the mistakes that were made in the past? Our ancient twisted karma, as we chant in the mornings. What is our responsibility? The actions of our ancestors, of our forebears, that we still hold to a certain extent in our own selves, and how do we use our practice, our awareness, our study to shed light on those mistakes, those things that happen, and the ways that we can make it right. And it's not something that just happens immediately, right? I think we all know that as powerful as something like the Emancipation Proclamation was, how long it took for it to kind of take effect, and how long it's taking to this day to be truly actualized. There's in this piece that I referenced from Charles Blow in the New York Times yesterday, it was a great piece. He quoted at the end Corey Walker, the director of the program of African American Studies at Wake Forest University. And Walker says, the idea of freedom, particularly for Black people in this country, is continuously being negotiated and contested. So Juneteenth marks a moment in the ever-evolving and expanding project of American democracy. It is, Walker said, a project that is never complete. It is never fulfilled, even at the moment of Juneteenth. And it's one that is ever evolving to this day. And so this is the sense when we gave this title, always being, always becoming, that we sometimes hear in Buddhist in talks. It's the freedom that is there, that's been proclaimed, and it's the freedom that has to become continuously. So this word emancipation was brought up recently in a Dharma talk, in another context. Does anybody remember? Anybody offer that?
No one remembers.
Come on. Emancipation actualized. Emancipation actualized from the Mountains and Waters Sutra.
It wasn't like the core point, so if you don't remember.
I thought it was the core point in our seminar. Oh. How's our... Are we still on Zoom? Okay. Great. We just, for those on Zoom, if anything happened funny, the lights all blipped out. What did I say?
Emancipation actualized.
Emancipation actualized. So there was this wonderful quote by Kozan in the opening lines of the Mountains and Waters Sutra. So in Kaz Tanahashi's translation, mountains and waters right now actualize the ancient Buddha expression. Each abiding in its condition unfolds its full potential. Because mountains and waters have been active since before the empty eon, they are alive in this moment. Because they have been the self since before form arose, they are emancipation actualized. Because they have been the self since before form arose, they are emancipation actualized. Another translation, just, it's not always emancipation. Because they have been the self since before form arose, they are liberated in their actual occurrence. And so this is one of those sentences, phrases that I think Dogen would say, ponder on this, study this, explore this. What does this mean? And we went into it a little bit in the seminar a couple weeks ago. What is the self here? What is emancipation? What is freedom? So this word, I like the use of the word. I mean, it's a kind of old-timey word, and it comes from, etymologically, from Latin, and man is hand. So emancipate is to like take your hand off, to like let go of your child, for instance, to allow them to be free. So emancipation in that sense. And so I looked up, this is wonderful with Kindle and other kind of online or electronic means, you can see how many times does this word show up in the Shobogenzo, and it's 49 times, as well as another 77 times for liberation. And as some of you know, if you've seen my talks before, I love to kind of find the original words there, the etymology of those words. And it's actually tricky because unlike in the koans where we can reference the old Chinese, in the Kana Shobogenzo, which is this Shobogenzo of Dogen's, Kana means vernacular. And this is written in Japanese of that time. So what is 1200s Japanese? It's not, as so I hear, I don't understand it myself, but so I hear it's not actually intelligible to modern Japanese speakers and needs to be translated. And so I believe Kaz did one of the first translations of the ancient Japanese to the modern Japanese. And then from there, you get all of the other translations we get of the Shobogenzo, not just from his, but from others. So when he's here, he'll be here in July. I want to ask him if I can get the original Japanese and then compare some of those, because I want to see what's this word emancipation, and is it the same as liberation or different, and freedom? But for our purposes, I think emancipation and liberation are synonymous. But just a geeky side note, if you're curious, well, I wonder how ancient or medieval Japanese sounded. Maybe it's a little like Middle English or early Middle English, which was about the same time period. And so I'm sure you've heard of the Canterbury Tales, and this was in the late 1300s. And I can read a little bit of it poorly, but it goes like this. Vandar april ved shora sota, the drochta march het perset de rota, en bader every vine in switch le cour, which vertu engendered is the floor.
They make you memorize that at St. John's.
Yeah, so. That's what. Yeah. And so it's kind of like if you read it, you can kind of figure out what it says. Some words are totally different. Some words are kind of there. And if you can read it in a certain way that it's more intelligible. But I imagine that the Kana Shobogenzo is something like that. Just like, what is he saying? And how do I translate it? And so there's a lot of interpretation here. And so emancipation, what does this mean? What does it mean for Dogen? What does it mean for us in Buddhism? Well, there are so many meanings for liberation, for freedom, and even in Buddhism. And I like to think of Buddhism in many ways as actually many different traditions and has their own definitions. And I don't really want to speak for any other schools or even our school. I would just give my opinion, but liberation can be, you can think of it as liberation from samsara. That's a classic. Well, what is samsara? Liberation from the cycle of existence that binds us. And of course, there's deeper exploration of what that means. Freedom from ignorance, of not knowing who we really are. Freedom from the mental afflictions, those movements of thought and heart that cause us to suffer. Maybe at the bottom of it, it really comes down to freedom from suffering. Maybe that's something all Buddhists could agree with. Freedom from suffering. And maybe suffering is not all what we all think it is. And so, for us in Zen, I think freedom is seeing reality as it is. Freedom is being in touch with what's arising in the moment, and not taking our conceptual frameworks, our opinions about the world to be what's what's really there, what's ultimately true. So I've talked about this before, but I love the metaphor of a rainbow, of the gradient of light. And it exemplifies in a way, the union of the relative and the absolute. So imagine a gradient of light, or a rainbow, and you've got all these different colors, right? But there are no lines in the actual rainbow. So how do we say, this is blue, this is green, this is red? We draw these imaginary lines, right? We say, here's this, and we can agree. You can see this is blue, this is green, and there's a line here, and what's here is this one, and what's here is this one. But we can see from this example that those lines are made up by our minds, and they're just added to that gradient. They're just mental constructs. And so we can agree on a mental construct, and we can have this, and that's the definition of relative. We have this agreed upon notion that helps us communicate about the world. This is the only way we could say, like, that's green or that's blue. But at a certain point, we might forget that the line is actually made up and that it's just relative. We say, they think this is really blue. And those people who think that this is actually green are wrong and deserve to whatever, be excommunicated. And so, it's a dumb example in a way, but it's like, of course, that lines aren't real. And yet, the rest of our lives, how much do we draw lines around color, the color of people's skin, black and white? It's like that was a hugely inflicting of suffering concept that was taken to be true and continues to this day to cause suffering in the world. There are differences, and this is one of the key things. You remove the lines, does it mean that there's only one color? No, there's infinite color, right? There's so much variety and so much diversity. And drawing the lines doesn't make you have more colors, it makes you have less colors, less possibility. And so freedom perhaps is not to just get rid of the lines necessarily, but to see the lines for what they are. To see reality as it is maybe doesn't mean to see anything other than that our conceptual frameworks are not what's actually there, that they're these agreed upon, what I thought we could call mutable mental models, M&Ms. So we have these M&Ms, and we take them to be reality. Yeah, and we take them as real. But our job, our kind of practice and our hopefully our realization of liberation is through the releasing of our kind of grip on these M&Ms. To see that my M&M and your M&M are not necessarily the same, but that maybe we can see each other's. And that, I think, is Bernie Glassman's practice of not knowing, of it's just my opinion, man. He was famous for it's just my opinion, man. It's just what I think is true, relatively true, is important to me. I'm willing to work for it, but I'm also willing to not hold it so tightly that I can't see your view, even if it's the opposite of mine. And so first, to release our kind of death grip on our opinions, and like, okay, I'm going to hold my opinions so that we can share our opinions together. And then to be able to bear witness, his second tenet, and to, now with my relaxed grasp and perhaps with yours, we can bear witness together and see what's there and see where the lines, not that we have to get rid of them, but maybe where I can move my line a little bit more to blue and you can move yours more to green, and compromise and have a structure that works best for as many beings as possible. And then the action that arises from that, his third tenet, the compassionate action or the loving action, is the one that can only come when we're able to not know, to loosen our grip on the opinions and to bear witness to those of others. And I imagine a kind of like a rainbow with all these lines moving until the whole group, the congress of our mind kind of coalesces into the optimal number of colors that we can now say, okay, now we can agree this is going to be beneficial. And let's not forget that they're just lines in our minds. So emancipation, or freedom, not just an event in time, like Walker said, but a continuous practice, and one that we continuously fail at and continuously, joyfully rise to the occasion to practice and serve. What's freedom for you?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sensei.
Is your mic on?
Oh no. Can you hear me? Ah, there we go. Is there a little echo? It's a little hot. I'm getting a yes up front, but a no in back. We can just turn it down a tad. Thank you. So good evening, everyone.
Good evening, Kozan.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening, Kozan.
Oh, that was nice. So, as Kodo mentioned, this is our first Dharma talk sitting in Taizando. It's my first time being in here for a Dharma talk, and it's really something. A lot of gratitude to Roshi and to Kodo for stewarding this creation for many years. It was no small task. And you can tell we're still kind of filling it with our practice. Coming today was a great gift because we're bringing this space to life. So thank you to all those who chose to come on this federal holiday to sit with us and listen to some words about emancipation. I don't think you mentioned that this is Kodo's birthday Dharma talk. So,
It was last week.
well, you didn't give the Dharma talk last week, and we did celebrate his birthday today with a delicious cake. Noah kind of chose the subject, maybe the day chose the subject for us, and so I'm going to give the same talk Kodo just gave, but you'll hear it in a different voice, and we'll see if it hits it all differently. Liberation. How do you practice liberation? How does liberation practice you? This is our question, and it's not a rare question in our tradition. As you may know, this question comes up often. So one place it comes up is in the transmission of the light, the story of teachers and students passing on the Dharma generation after generation. And we have actually many versions of this. One I love is the third Chinese ancestor, Senseis, in his engagement with the fourth Chinese ancestor, Dogen. So Dogen is looking for a cure to his ills. He's having a lot of difficulty. And it feels spiritual, and it feels psychological, and it feels physical. And so he goes to Senseis as a kind of healer, as a kind of sage. And he bows to the master and he says, I beg of the priest, in his great compassion, to give me the teaching of liberation. So we're going to get the teaching. Senseis replies, who's binding you? And Dogen says, no one's binding me. And Senseis replies, then why are you seeking liberation? And with those words, as is how these stories always end, Dogen was greatly awakened. So if you know these stories, you'll know this kind of is a similar story to the first Chinese ancestor and the second Chinese ancestor. There's basically a few of these that kind of rhyme with each other, variations on the same kind of Zen joke, which is, I'm so bound up, I'm so shackled. And the teacher who somehow expresses the absence of that problem in their life says, really? And suddenly the student, oh, you're right. Maybe it's not the way I thought it was. And that's the transmission, generation after generation, so simple. And so a little bit about Dogen, so we can get to know this version. because he has some words for us about liberation. So he eventually practiced with Sengsan. He refined his understanding of this liberation year after year. They practiced together. And before the third ancestor died, he gave him the robe and the bowl. And Daoshin was a very determined practitioner, as many were at that period of Zen, just full of energy and a kind of tenacity. And they would do things you thought, can a human even do that? And so Daoshin, for 60 years, never laid down. Only sat up and stood up. And this was a practice at the time. Who knows if actually for 60 years he never laid down prone, but there were kind of methods for sitting up and sitting in meditation and sleeping, actually sitting up. So for 60 years, he never laid prone. And there's a story of bandits coming to the city he was in and about to sack it, and somehow spirits appear on the ramparts. And they say, oh, a serious practitioner must be in there. We probably should skip this city. So they're surrounding the city, they see the spirits, and they actually just continue on. And then these are like 3 miracles for, what is it? You have to get cardinalized or canonized in Catholicism. You need 3 miracles. These are his 3 miracles. So that was the second. The third was the emperor later in his life in 643, took interest in his teachings and said, come to the capital and teach for us. I'd really love for you to be here. And Daoshin 3 times said, I'm a little ill. I don't think I can make it. This is a guy who hasn't lied down in 60 years. So, and the 4th time, the emperor sends a messenger and says, if he doesn't come, cut off his head. Rough times. And the messenger arrives and says to Daoshin, this is the predicament I'm in. This is what I've been asked to do by the emperor. And Daoshin just sticks out his head. And the messenger decides not to cut it off, goes back to the emperor and says, it was pretty impressive. He seemed really okay with me taking his life. And the emperor was wowed and sent fine silks and appreciation. And so he got away with that one. And then at the end of his life, in 651, Daoshin was dying. And he's sitting upright, as was his practice for so many decades. And he gathers his followers around him and his students. And he says, all things are completely liberated. All things are completely liberated. These are his dying words. All things. You must each keep this and pass it on to others. So you must all keep this truth and somehow pass it on to others. That was his teaching. Comes down to us today. So all things are completely liberated. And yet it seems like it's not always so. So this is our question, this is our predicament, this is our practice, and what we honor today of all days. And as this is Zen, it can often seem like there are 2 truths. So here's my stab at what these 2 truths might feel like. On the one hand, as Dogen would say, when all things are Buddha Dharma, everything's already liberated. Everything's manifesting its true self in a dynamic, infinite loom of the universe right now, which means forever. Not a single thing impedes anything else. Not in the slightest. How could it, when everything is everything? As Hongzhi teaches us, not a single atom or grain of rice impedes you or prevents you from straightening yourself, he says. So that's the one hand. On the other hand, when each thing is separate and striving for its own realization, its own efficacy, then everywhere we turn, something binds us. Our identities and their inherited feuds bind us. Debt binds us. Taxes binds us. Death binds us. The stupidity of others, the wars they start, the rules they impose, the pollution that they cause, all seem to bind us. Not to mention our own stupidity, the problems, confusions, misunderstandings that we cause ourselves. This body and its frailties bind us, our anxiety binds us, even our awakening binds us. So too, of course, do our words, which we know so well in this tradition, which can't help but restrict reality in their attempts to contain it. So everywhere we turn, everything is fettering everything else. Everything's bound up. So what do we do? This brings me to a story that I just heard. My partner, Sarah, was at a sesshin this past week outside of Seattle. And they just got out and we were on the phone and they conveyed a story from the second day where there was a young man in his early 30s who, I think it was probably his first sesshin, and they were teaching him where to bow and how to hold his hands and how to eat and how to walk and how to chant in the Zendo. And apparently he had quite a voice and a kind of Broadway way about him, and his chant wasn't quite in line with the style of chanting, and everyone could kind of hear it out of the crowd. And so one of the senior teachers went to him and said, you know, we have a form, and if we could, here's the form, could you follow it? And he probably said, okay. And the next day, he couldn't help it. He chanted in these loud and boisterous way, and everyone else had their form, and they could hear him. And so the senior teacher went to him after breakfast and said, you probably didn't notice, but you're chanting in this particular way, and we're creating a sense of one body, you know, the feeling of freedom that we aren't actually separate. And could you chant in this other way? And he started yelling and saying, what do you want me to do? And, oh, you want this and you want that. And everything's binding me here. And he left and he got in his car and he rolled down the windows. And before he left, he yelled out the window, free the Dharma! Free the Dharma! Free the Dharma! Those of you who've sat sesshin, you know, you can empathize. So there's a predicament. One person thinks, you know, if we can all feel the non-separateness of harmony, that's freedom. And another person has another idea of what freedom feels like. And we all have our ideas. What do we do? So here's our two truths. It seems like there's these two things. We're both entirely free and everywhere bound. And so what is the path that does not turn away from these truths and is not limited by them? What is our path? How do we walk that narrow road that when we walk it covers the whole earth? So it reminds me of a story, another story. And this is the story of Reverend Carlton Pearson. Do people know this story? Do people know Pearson's story? Oh, what joy. So he died actually in November of last year. He was 70. And his story is just beautiful. He was a very successful, at a young age, as is sometimes the case in this tradition, Southern Baptist preacher. This kind of charismatic black guy in his 20s who just hit the scene like crazy and took over. He was like the preacher in his 20s. And he had a congregation of 20,000 people outside Tulsa. And he was the pastor to President George Bush, you know, that by the time he was in his 30s. And the most famous gospel singers would go through and visit his mega church, you know, his big revivalist church. And he preached, and he was, you can see videos, was just magnetic. And he was preaching a certain gospel. And a lot of it had to do with, you know, exorcising the devil from people and saving people from going to hell. Hell was a big part of this tradition. And so he preached this for a couple decades. And one day in 1994, he's in his McMansion outside Tulsa. He's really been successful. This is how he tells it. And he's sitting on his bed with his giant screen TV on the other side of the room. And he's watching a documentary. He's watching news about Rwanda. This is the time of the Rwanda genocide. And he's looking at young people starving. The war caused mass starvation. And he's looking at documentary footage of these people who he knew would never hear the teachings of Christ, which is their salvation, at least as he had preached it. And he had this sudden epiphany, which was the God I know would never sentence these young people to the fires of hell, let's say. I'm sure he had more eloquent words for it. But this thing that he had been teaching and kind of believed all of a sudden didn't make sense. It was an idea, it was a conviction that he saw was shackling him, was separating him. And it struck him like lightning. Oh. And he says later on, I believe that most people on earth will go to heaven because of the unconditional love of God and the redemptive work of the cross, which is already accomplished. We can recognize that language. And so the really courageous thing is what happens next, which he goes to his congregation and he starts preaching that. He starts preaching that all beings are already saved. He starts preaching that we all belong to one another. He calls it the gospel of inclusion. And they're not a fan. In fact, everyone leaves very quickly. It takes about a month for 90% of his congregation to hit the road. And eventually the building's foreclosed on and the whole thing is shuttered. But he keeps preaching the gospel of inclusion. And he finds a handful of others who want to preach it with him. And he doesn't go and try and change the whole Baptist church and make a life out of trying to change everyone's mind. He just preaches the truth that he knows, that's freed him, that is freedom for him. And from the histories I've read, a couple hundred people maybe attend his weekly sermons instead of 20,000. But he lives a life of liberation. And there's a documentary about him on Netflix. There seems to be a documentary about everyone on Netflix. So if you want to learn more, you can watch it. I haven't. Actually, I read a long piece about him. But it's a story that I've held for almost 2 decades now as inspirational for me. What is it to hear the Declaration of Independence, to hear the Emancipation Proclamation, and then to follow it, to have the courage to live it? How do we practice liberation? So maybe, like all those in Texas so many years ago who finally were told you're free. It's been a while, but you didn't know this. It happened a couple years ago, but you're free. Maybe in some way we've already heard that or experienced it, and it's really our practice to live it. How do we live it? How do we live freedom, knowing that there's no arriving, that these two truths will always be the stuff of the road we walk? So that's maybe a good question for us to take with us tonight. And I have to close a quote from Dogen, because we came to a Soto Zen community, so that's what we do. So this is from Dogen's first fascicle. This is also Kaz's translation. This is from Bendoa. And I'm reading it tonight because for those of you just here tonight, we just finished a young adult sesshin, which was really brilliant. and sweet, and we're all still a little tender from it. And this quote came up a few times. So this is the whole thing, which we haven't read. When even for a moment you sit upright in samadhi, that is, upright in Zazen, expressing the Buddha form in all three activities of body, speech, and mind, the whole world becomes the Buddha, and the entire sky turns into enlightenment. All beings in the world together realize the state of great emancipation. When even for a moment you sit upright in Zazen, expressing the Buddha form in the three activities of body, speech, and mind, the whole world becomes the Buddha, and the entire sky turns into enlightenment. All beings in the world together realize the state of great emancipation. Well, it was wonderful to practice with all of you. It's wonderful to celebrate your birthday, dear Kodo. Thank you, everyone.